to do to put them on your car and how it affects fitment on your car. So I want to first and foremost thank you for joining us. This is our first live episode of 2021. I'm glad that you all made it. I don't know about you, but I'm glad to be back in the new year working. We had a good holiday. I hope that all of you had a good holiday break as well, but we're happy to be back at it. So let's go ahead and jump into it. I've got a bunch of wheels in front of me, but basically what we're going to be covering today is a lot of questions that had been asked. So thanks to you all that had submitted your questions whenever we prompted about what you'd like to learn, what questions you have about wheels, offsets, and things of that nature. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I've got a big long list, and we'll try to cover quite a bit of this, assuming that we've got enough time to do so. If I don't answer your question, or if we don't cover your question, please drop a comment down below, and we will get to that as soon as we can. If we have enough time in the video, I will try to answer it towards the end. If we don't, we will answer it in the comments below here on Facebook and also on YouTube when this gets uploaded later. So specifically, what is wheel offset? So offset is another word or another term of measuring how your wheel, this mating surface that bolts up to the hub on your knuckle or the upright on the car, where that is in relationship to the center line of the wheel. So offset is specifically about the measurement from the center line of the wheel to that hub base where it mounts. You've probably also heard of backspacing. That's another way to do this kind of measurement. It's different though. Offset is generally measured from, is measured from the center line of the wheel to that hub face where it mates up, and it's usually done in millimeters. Backspacing is actually where you start at the back of the wheel. You measure from the back to that point that mates up to where you're bolting it onto the hub, and that's usually measured in inches. So if you're doing import cars, JDM stuff, a lot of European stuff, most often you're going to hear offset being used. If you're talking muscle cars, American iron, that kind of stuff, a lot of times you'll hear backspacing be a more common term for when they're talking about wheel specs like that. You can measure either way. It doesn't make a difference. A lot of times it depends on where you're buying your wheels. Most manufacturers for specific kinds of cars will have it one way or the other, but you can measure it both ways. Neither one is wrong. It's just preference. Metric versus imperial. So that's all we're talking about, is just where that mating surface is, and that mating surface will determine how far in or out the wheel is mounted in relation to your hub. So, why would you care about offset? Why do you need to know about the offset numbers? So in general, if you're working with a smaller or narrower wheel, say like this wheel is a 7-inch wide wheel, it's not as important because you have more room. Say if my arms were your fender, you have to fit that wheel somewhere inside the fender. With a narrower wheel, you've got a lot more room. You've got wiggle to be able to mount it. So it's not quite as important. But if you're into performance and you want to go with an 8-inch wheel or even a 9-inch wheel, that way you can put on some big meaty tires for more traction, more grip, then that offset number starts mattering quite a bit more because, one, you want that fitment within inside your fender to be correct, but also a lot of times you want your stance to be wider because a wider stance means that you have less weight transfer, which generally means more grip. So I've got a few different wheels here in front of me, and they range from NAs, NBs, NCs, and Ds. And obviously we're talking about Miatas. So these 4 generations, they each have some quirks that are a little bit different from each other, but generally speaking, the narrow versus wide wheel thing, it's going to be applicable for most people, especially if you don't want to roll your fenders, or if you don't want to cut them up because you don't want to do like a big over fender or something like that. So the fitment part of it is probably the most important for most people trying to fit different wheels on their cars. A very common wheel width for a lot of Miatas, whether it be NAs or NDs, is usually an 8-inch wide wheel. That's the most common size, 7s and 8s, depending on where you are. but usually an 8-inch wide wheel is a very common width for a performance aftermarket wheel. And just to give you some generic specs for what usually works for these generations is that if you have an NA or NB, we kind of consider them a similar platform. They're very, very close as far as their suspension is concerned. But with an 8-inch wide wheel, you typically want to land at about a 35, 36 millimeter offset. That's about right for placing it in the fender where you're not going to have issues where it's going to rub, the tire's going to rub on the inside of the fender. It's also going to allow you to run with stock or stock diameter springs, so you don't have to change out your suspension. It's kind of the sweet spot for you do get more width compared to stock wheels that are 6, 6.5, or even 7 inches wide. You get a wider wheel, but you're not pushing it so far. On an NC, third generation Miata, you usually want to aim for about a 45 to 48 millimeter offset on an 8-inch wide wheel. Again, you're gaining about an inch in width on your wheel, but it's not so far that you're going to be running into issues where you need to roll your fenders or you need to worry about smaller diameter springs, anything like that. The ND is pretty similar, about 45 millimeter. You've got a few millimeters leeway, of course, with any of these, but about 45 is right for an ND on an 8-inch wheel. And the diameter doesn't matter for any of these as far as what we're talking about with offset. An offset doesn't take into account diameter, so diameter doesn't have anything to do with the offset. Just keep that in mind. Likewise, for tires, a lot of questions that we get are, what's a good size tire to fit in my wheel that I don't need to worry about rolling the fenders or having issues with rubbing? And again, this is going to be focused more on the 8-inch wide wheels because that's a very common width of wheel to use for Miatas across all of the platforms. On the NAs and NBs, running a 15x8, we like to use either a 205 50-15 or a 225 45-15. And basically the 205 mounted on the 8-inch wide wheel, it'll be a little bit stretched on the sidewall, but not so much that it's dangerous. It's not like the scene, the stretched tire camber scene kind of fitment. It's not like that. And I know there's some guys out there that really like that. To each their own. Generally, we're a bit more performance oriented, less on the aesthetic side as far as some of the more trendy fashions are concerned with wheels and tires and fitment. But for performance sake, we like either the 205 with just a little bit of stretch, or on an 8-inch wide wheel, the 225s are a nice square look. And really, as far as boiling down to what one is a better choice, look at your tires. What tires do you actually want? I would put a much higher importance on picking the tire that you want to run, and then see which size it's available in, instead of choosing the size and then picking the tire. Because the tire compound and the tread and its characteristics are going to make a lot bigger difference in how the car drives and handles compared to an extra 10 or 20 millimeters worth of width on your tire contact patch with the ground. Moving on to the NCs, they generally will run with a little bit wider tires, and this is also due to the market being a little bit more saturated with passenger car tires that are this size for 17s, but a 225/45 or a 235/45 17 is the most common size to fit 8s for NCs. And those sizes, again, they're going to be right about square. The 225, 235, they're going to be pretty square. It depends on the tires. Some tires have a more square look to them, and some of them have a little bit more rounded edges. But both of those are a good match for 17x8. And likewise on the NBs, since they are still a 17-inch diameter wheel, they also like to use a 225/45 or a 235/40 17-inch tire. So again, tire choices are more important than width, in my opinion. Make a bigger difference to ride quality and grip than the actual width is concerned when you're talking, 1 or 2 sizes difference. Okay, it's a lot of blathering about sizes, so hopefully you've not gone totally vegetable talking about numbers. One of the questions that is another very common one is, how do I know what offset wheels will fit over my brakes? So if you've got a big brake kit, or maybe you have one of the NDs that came with the Brembos, you want to know, will this aftermarket wheel fit over my brakes? And that's a very good, important question. You always want to check before you buy. And the clear answer is there isn't a clear answer. Offset is not the only determining factor when it comes to deciding if a wheel is going to fit over your brake calipers. More often than not, I'm making all kinds of noise, sorry. More often than not, the shape on the backside of the spokes will make a much bigger impact on the fitment with calipers than the actual offset where it mounts to the hub. The offset certainly does have a lot to do with it, because if you do have clearance issues because your spokes are pretty flat instead of being curved, because a lot of aftermarket calipers, they basically are bigger and wider because they have a more aggressive curvature, because they have more pistons instead of like the stock ones that just have one piston on the inside. So having a curvature like this is usually advantageous. But even if you have a flat spoke like this, you can use offset, and you can use wheel spacers to push that wheel away from your brakes to give you more room. So they're related, but offset's not the only answer, or wheel spacers aren't the only answer. There's a bit more involved, and a lot of it has to do with the design of the spokes. One of the questions is kind of along the same lines is, what offsets do you recommend for non-power assisted? So if you've got a manual steering rack Miatas, you can go with mostly the same offsets. There's not going to be a huge difference. If you go with a bit more aggressive offset, it may be a little bit more difficult to turn the car at parking lot speeds and when you're sitting still. So if you have a manual car and you're really trying to just dial in the steering effort, you could go with a little bit less aggressive offset, or take out your wheel spacers or whatever, and that'll make it a little bit better. A much bigger difference as far as what your steering feel will be like is if you have narrow, skinny tires that are hard all seasons, versus if you have big, wide, sticky Hoosiers, they're going to be much harder to turn. So the width of your tire and the compound of your tire are definitely going to make a bigger difference to steering feel or effort at low-level speeds with a manual steering rack compared to power. Is it better to have a wide track on a dry surface as compared to a narrow track on a, say, slippery or a low grip surface? That one is more about weight transfer. And this is kind of a two-part question. So do you want a wider track? Do you want a narrower track? Do you get better grip in one versus the other? On most situations, you want the widest track as possible, because when you have a wider track, you're more stable. There's going to be less weight transfer, and ultimately that usually means more grip. If you're running on gravel or ice or something like that that's not asphalt, you may want something different, but it's probably going to be different because you need better fitment, because you're using big knobbly tires, or you've got a really cool lift kit with a big suspension system that you have lots and lots of travel. So that'll be a different kind of scenario. If you're doing something like that that's a bit more unorthodox, you'll probably have a much different suspension setup and tire choice than you would if you're doing some kind of an asphalt or street application. So a wider track is going to make a much bigger difference there, because it is giving you more stability. And you can think of it the same way. If you come up to your buddy and he's standing with his feet together, you can push him pretty easily. He's going to move, his weight's going to transfer. But if he has his feet spread apart, then if you try to shove him, he's going to be a lot more stable. He won't be able to move, or won't be moved as easily. It's a similar kind of theory. What if you approach the limits of offset for your chassis? Can it damage the car? Yeah, I suppose. You can, if you run too aggressive an offset, what'll happen usually, say if you want to have a lower number offset, that means that your wheels are pushing out. So instead of like a 45, if you had a 35, that moves your wheels out 10 millimeters. So if you have too aggressive of an offset, your tires may start running into the fenders, and start rubbing. Or you could also have it the other way if you have really, really, really positive offset. So if you had a plus 75 millimeter offset, just throwing it out there, and that would push your wheel and tire way far in, you might actually rub on the inside somewhere or up against the top of your fender liner or something like that, but it will be on the inside. So it's all a balancing act. Most common though is usually guys that are running out and gals that are rubbing on their fenders because they have a more aggressive, wider, beefier stance wheel and tire setup. And it can range anything from just making scuffs to cutting up your tires. If it's in the front and you've got really, really aggressive wide wheels and you have the car turned at full lock, you may actually rub the inside of the wheel, usually like right here. You may rub that against your control arms or possibly even your tie rods for your steering. So yeah, it's usually not a catastrophic failure unless you're doing something really goofy, but it can still damage components. So it is something to be aware of. You do need to be moderately careful when you're choosing wheels and tires and that you're checking things. This is a big one. I think there's a lot of misinformation out on the internet about this, and it's about ride height. And does my ride height affect what wheel and tire I can run and what offset I can run? And if you're looking at it from a very basic standpoint, yes, but really it's no. And the reason is that when your wheel is moving up and down in its wheel travel, and this is regardless of your ride height, it's the same wheel travel. That wheel and tire is always going to be moving the same arc, the same range, assuming that you're not changing your alignment settings. So even if your ride height, well, let's just say, even if your ride height is really high like this, is this going to affect the way that the tire interacts with the fender compared to if your ride height was like this? Nope, because it's the same travel. This tire and wheel is moving in the same arc regardless of your ride height. Again, assuming your alignment numbers are the same. If you change your alignment, then your wheel is going to be moving, and that may affect fitment. But your ride height does not affect if you're going to rub or if you're not going to rub. What it does affect is how often you'll rub. If you run a really tall ride height, then your suspension movement may only go, up to here when you hit a pothole or bump. But if you slam your car down low, you may get rubbing more often, even if it's the same alignment settings, same wheel and tire, just because you've moved your available range up so high that your tire is now spending all of its time rubbing on the top because you're so low. So the offset and the tire does not matter in that kind of situation. What's more important is, did you go too low? Did you already have an inappropriate offset? Did you set up your suspension correctly? And if you didn't, you may be experiencing that, but it's a question of how often, not if it will or if it won't. And if you want to know how to do that, if you're experimenting, one of the things you can do is, like with this car, what we've done is take off the spring. We've removed the spring from the suspension, or from off the shock rather. And ideally, you should loosen up your bushings. We didn't on this one because we're not taking it fully apart. But this allows the suspension to move and you don't have to try to compress the spring. But here in this case, you can see if I max out the droop travel, this is where it sits. Now, if I max out the compression travel, that's as high as it's going to go. It's the bump stop. So you can see that's the amount of travel, and I can tell that there's not going to be any clearance issues at this ride height with this alignment setting and with these wheels and tires. So if you're experimenting, you want to go with a big wide 9, 10, whatever wide inch wheel, then you can do that. You'd also want to do it in the front where you're spinning, turning the tire as well as compressing and moving it around. You'll run into all kinds of exciting fitment issues on the front if you try to run 9s, 10s, or bigger, just as an FYI. So be prepared to get out the BFH and probably, the cutoff wheel and the grinder and all that kind of fun stuff too. So if you're racing the car, it's worthwhile. But just know that it's something that you should be doing if you're looking to push the bleeding edge of wheel widths and offsets. This is a very interesting question, asking about what is the best offset when lifting your Miata using the Paco lift kit, the 3-inch lift kit. This is a very open-ended question. The 3-inch lift kit is really cool. I've run it myself. It's a lot of fun, especially if you want to go run off-road or through the snow and the ice. You can get pretty crazy. It's usually for the unorthodox kind of people that own Miatas. And it really boils down to how crazy do you want to go. If you want to do a mild kind of lift, you're not looking to put on, 35s or something crazy like that. That's still cool. But if you're looking to do maybe a 25-inch tall tire instead of a 23-inch tall tire for, a stock 15 kind of wheel, stock size tires on an NA or NB Miata is right around 23 inches tall. So if you want to do like a 25-inch tall tire, just a little bit, so that way you've got some more sidewall, you can get into some of the small truck tires in that size. Then for that kind of a setup, you don't have to do anything too terribly crazy as far as cutting the body is concerned. But generally what happens when you lift a car like that is that you get into some weird areas of the camber curves on the NAs and NBs. In the rear, you'll actually end up with a ton of negative camber. And in the front, you'll end up with a little bit of positive camber. So it's all kinds of messed up. So you do need to worry about correcting those things. If you're on a super, super tight budget, I've talked to some guys that have gotten away with it by using wheels that had either zero offset or even negative offset wheels. That just means that instead of having try not to bang them up, instead of having the hub mounting surface about, here on the front side, a negative offset is actually behind the center line, closer to the inside of the wheel, just pushing the wheel and tire that much further out. But I've heard of guys that have done that, and some that have used even as wide as I think 2-inch spacers, wheel spacers, and that's just to get the wheels away from the car, especially in the rear, because you can actually get the wheels touching the springs on the back if you don't correct your camber using the Paco Motorsports rear upper control arms that are adjustable. The Bauer extended lower ball joints are another good option for fixing the positive camber in the front. So I won't get off too much into the weeds on that one, because it does vary a lot. It's a very interesting thing to do. If you have more questions about it, give us a call, and we'd be happy to talk about it, because it'll vary quite a bit depending on your setup and your goal. So sorry, there's not a magical perfect offset for Paco 3-inch lift kit, because it'll vary a lot depending on your tires, what you're doing, if you're planning on doing other parts to help adjust for your camber, that kind of stuff. Okay, back a little bit closer to the norm. What is a good offset to get a more flush look on my Miata? And this will again depend on what you're willing to do, but assuming that you want to leave your fenders alone, you don't want to roll the inside lip of your fenders, the numbers that I quoted earlier about NAs and NBs wanting an 8-inch wide wheel with about 35 to 36 millimeter offset, NCs with an 8-inch around 45, 48 millimeters, and then NDs with an 8-inch that's about 45 millimeters or so, give or take. You can kind of go either direction a little bit. That's going to be about as far as you can push it before you start chancing having that issue with you rubbing the fenders. If you are willing to roll your fenders, you can get away with another 5, 10, maybe even 15 millimeters of offset or wheel spacer, and you can push it even further out. Whenever you get that close to the fenders, just realize that you're going to need to do a little bit of testing too. Do some fitment tests, pull a spring out, make sure you're not going to be rubbing with your current ride height, or when your current ride height, and with your current alignment. So I would stick to that. You can play around with it a little bit, and actually, I have another resource that we'll talk about here in just a little bit that'll help you decide or help you compare different wheels and offsets a little bit. Here's a question about installing a wide body kit on their Miata. Do you have any tips or things to consider when going with a wide body, as far as the wheel choice, the width, the offset, that kind of thing? And this really depends on your kit that you're installing. Does that manufacturer give you any kind of specification for these are an extra 40, 50, 60, 70, whatever millimeter wider than your stock fenders? That'll give you an idea. If you've got some unknown fenders and you don't know what they are, then you probably should just plan on installing them first, and then you see after you've got them on there, you can measure comparing to your stock fenders and see what extra width you have on top of that, because that'll help you determine that, oh, this has an extra 30 millimeters of width beyond the stock fender, so I can get with a wider offset wheel, or I can go, a wider wheel or a greater offset, more aggressive to push that wheel further out to fill in the flares a little bit. It probably is going to boil down to test and tune, but it's going to make your life a little bit easier to install the fenders first, take your measurements. That way you can kind of have a good idea, or at least this is the general ballpark that I'm going to be stepping into when I'm shopping for wheels. Another one that you should probably look into if you're doing something like that is to get a wheel fitment tool. So they look pretty odd, but basically it's a tool that you bolt onto the hub, and it has usually like a rod that simulates kind of the profile of a tire, and you can lengthen that rod. There's also an adjustment where you can move it in and out to accommodate for offset. So buying or renting one of those wheel offset tools, you can kind of get an idea of, okay, this is about what I'm looking for. You can adjust for tire size and for the offset of your wheel. So it's a good handy tool before you spend money buying some fancy wheels or some brand new tires. And to give you some reference material, if you are shopping wheels and tires, if you're looking at offsets, if you really want to get nerdy about comparing some wheels, some websites that I like to use a lot when I'm comparing this kind of information is 1010 Tires, so 1010tires.com. There is a wheel offset calculator where you can plug in the width of your wheel and the offset, and it'll tell you what the difference is on the inside and the outside. So say if you wanted to shop some 7-inch wide wheels versus some 8-inch wide wheels, or 9s or 10s or whatever, but they have different offsets, and you're like, all these numbers, I don't know what they mean, because you're converting inches and millimeters and stuff is moving. Just go to this wheel calculator website, plug in the numbers, makes it really easy, because you can just see, oh, this moves the outside face of the wheel 13 millimeters further out. This retracts it 25 millimeters. It's very easy. It makes this process of crunching numbers a lot simpler. 1010tires.com. Another one, if you're looking at, I want to run some big silly tires, or I want to compare the diameter of these 7-inch wheels that I have. They've got the stock tires on them, but I want to run a 9-inch wheel with some big meaty racetrack tires, whatever. But I want to keep the same diameter, so that way my speedos happen. A good website to compare calculations for tire size is tiresize.com. Pretty straightforward, right? But it's one that you plug in the numbers for if you're looking for 205 50/15 versus maybe a 245 40/15, and you can compare that, okay, they're a couple tenths different, they're okay, or wow, this tire is an extra inch taller, that's way too tall, I'm going to have rubbing issues, my speedo is going to be unhappy, that kind of stuff. So those are two very good reference websites I use all the time, 1010 Tires and tiresize.com. A good reference that I would say if you're looking to, again, dive into some more specs on this kind of stuff, and especially if you're looking at fitment and you're concerned about tire wear, that kind of stuff, go to flyingmiata.com and go click on the tech section, suspension, and then recommended alignment numbers. And we have the alignment specs that we recommend for NAs, NBs, NCs, and Ds. These are kind of a 90% coverall for most Miata owners. If you're tracking the car really hard, or if you'd like to drive at specific tracks, or the car has a very specific purpose, you'll probably deviate from our alignment specs, and that's fine. But for most people that are street driving their car, doing some autocross, even some track time, these are good specifications to start from. Most people don't vary from them at all, but If you don't know where to start with alignment specs, check it out. FlyMiata.com, click on Tech and Suspension, then recommended alignment numbers. Okay, I've covered our list. I blathered a lot. Do we have any questions, or do we have time to answer more questions? Or have I talked a whole bunch and we need to end? We've got one? We got some time? Okay, what do we have?
One on topic here. What's the widest that could fit on an ND without rubbing the fenders?
So just to make sure that everyone heard that, what's the widest wheel and tire that you can fit on an ND?
Doesn't say.
Yeah, we'll just assume wheel and tire they can fit on an ND without rubbing the fenders. We have run a 17 by 9, so that's this big boy. And we have run it with, you can run a 235, let's see, what was it, 235/40? Yeah, 235/40, you can fit that without rubbing. There are even some 245/40s that you can get. I think the Yokohama S-Drive, if they have any of those left, if they have any of the Yokohama Advent Fliva V701s, they would probably be pretty close. Basically, when you start reaching into the 245 range on a 9-inch wide wheel on the ND, you get really close. Some tires will work just barely, and other ones that have a more square, blocky tread profile are going to rub. So if you're running a 9-inch wide wheel with stock fenders and you want to go as wide as possible, plan on at least having a backup of rolling your fenders in case you end up with some tires that are a little bit too square. If you don't have to worry about that, stick to 235s is the simple answer. And we probably have missed some of your questions too, so I apologize. Anything that we have missed, especially if it's on topic, we'll get to that in the comments below on Facebook as well as our YouTube channel. So thank you very much again for listening to me go on and on and on about lots of numbers and specifications. And I thank you for the probably 2 or 3 really nerdy guys that were following right along with me. I appreciate that. The rest of you, if you have any questions, let us know. We'd be happy to talk to you about them. We're here Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. There are new hours for 2021. We're available via phone and on email and even through Facebook. So you can email us at support@flymiata.com or reach out to our Facebook page and actually Instagram. I always forget that one.